Okay, so I guess we are ready to get started with the third and final panel of quite an exciting afternoon and set of sessions. So this third panel and final panel of the day will focus on mapping new geographies, where through specific examples of applied research, we will be able to establish a dialogue regarding geographic representation and design. And before I specifically introduce the speakers, I just want to sort of highlight 2 points that I think for me are relevant and that are going to begin to surface between the two presentations. And the first one has to do with certain ideas or modes of geographic representation and design agency, and how spatial data and its critical visualization paired with design synthesis has given new forms of agency to the designer within a broader social and political processes within an ever-increasing visual culture. So the first one for me is important in this relationship between sort of geographic representation, design disciplinary know-how, and the agency that the design disciplines at large are having today within sort of a broader public debate. The other one for me has to do with geographic representation and new/shifted scales of design practice, and how geographic representation and how current geographic representation technologies have questioned traditional geographic and scalar domains of the design disciplines affiliated with the built environment. So with those two sort of points or caveats, I want to go ahead and introduce today's presenters. The first presenter today is Sarah Williams, who is currently the director of Columbia University's Spatial Information Design Lab and teaches at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University. Sarah has a background in geography, landscape and urban design, and urban planning. Sarah got a master's degree from MIT in city planning and urban design and received her bachelor's degree in geography and history from Clark University. Her current research interests focus on the intersection of technology and the urban realm, with a particular focus on using mobile computing to help better understand urban spaces. And our second presenter is Maria Arquero de Alarcón, who is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan with a joint appointment in urban and regional planning and architecture. Originally from Spain, she is a licensed architect and an urban designer, as well as a landscape architect. Her most recent work focuses on the interface between landscape and urbanism and issues of interpretation and representation. Additional research interests include the use, management, and design of public open space with a strong environmental concern. So with that, I would like to welcome first Sarah and then Maria. Thank you.
See if we can get to my level. I just want to start by saying I'm very honored to be here today. I feel like we've had a lot of really exciting talks, really interesting, and I just feel honored to be able to participate with everybody. When Charles asked me to come speak, I was particularly interested because I finished a paper thinking about how planners have dealt with this kind of issue of data in the city and kind of the backlash to it, and a lot of that is wrapped up into GIS, and so I was really excited to get an opportunity to talk about my paper and talk about it with people who have all been thinking about it, so get some of the ideas. The talk, I call my talk Data Sequence because I think we have had a series of relationships, for good or bad, with using data to tell stories. In fact, I would argue that the history of data in place and our pendulating relationship with it is something that we can see through time. Anyone familiar with Michael Friendly's article on the history of data visualization can attest to this. Sequence also connotes the idea of storytelling. of telling stories about the place we live through the sequence of data, something involved in the work that I perform. And I think kind of this idea of sequencing is in all the work that you'll see today. Let's see, whoops, went too far. So what sequence are we at today? Where are we? What sequence are we in? And I think we're in a period of data enthusiasm and data visualization, and I would like to make a call for critical data visualization. I think that we need to think and contextualize our enthusiasm for information and our enthusiasm to consume visualizations. There's more data in the world than ever before, and there will soon be far more. According to the International Data Corporation, in 2011 alone, 1.8 zettabytes, or 1.8 trillion gigabytes of data was created, the equivalent to every US citizen writing 3 tweets per minute for roughly 27,000 years. It's a big quote. Thank you. Thank you, International Data Corporation. Digital archives and new data collected from embedded devices and common items such as clothing, cell phones, vehicles, roads, buildings, and anything else you can think of will fundamentally change the way we plan, finance, and move about cities. One of the biggest issues on the minds of city planners, politicians, policy analysts, large corporations, and citizens is how can we implement innovations in technology and data collection to analyze the places we live through means we've never been able to achieve before. This is evidenced by the fact that New York City recently hired a new digital officer for the city, chief digital officer, and also created a new digital roadmap. For many urban strategists, including planners, landscape architects, urban designers, architects, data in its use in communities has been an uneasy one. This is largely because of the way these tools have been misused in the past, whether overly invasive, breaching confidentiality, or inaccurately interpreted. Ultimately, it was a backlash to rationality that data and technology embodies, which put our use of it to tell stories about place to the sidelines. The story, as has been told to this has been very black and white. But as much in the world, the interesting intersection is the realm where these two ideas meet. But this is often how the story is told. The juxtaposition between the quantitative and qualitative planner, the modernist versus the postmodernist versus the post-postmodernist, the top-down planner versus the bottom-up, the humanist versus the scientist, the numbers versus the interview, the right brain versus the left. But I think everyone in the room knows that it's much more complicated than that. And I think my research situates itself in the middle of these forces. So the struggle between these two oppositional forces has a lot to do with the essence of what maps are all about. Dennis Wood writes in his book, The Power of Maps, the power is the ability to do work, which is what maps do. They work. In some ways, this is an abstract idea with multiple levels of meaning. Maps work because they tell us something new. They work because they are tools in which we can make decisions. They work because they explain ideas and tell stories. But which sides do maps work for? In many ways, the answer is subjective and depends on the norms and values of the people who use maps as a visualization tool, as well as the person who creates the maps. I want maps to work for policy, to expose issues that we haven't seen before, to help populations give them a voice. So I think, like, to kind of contextualize this idea a little bit, I'm gonna do a ever so brief, and you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to miss lots of pieces of the history, but I think it's important to kind of contextualize this kind of misaligned relationship in planning with data. And I think let's fast forward to the birth of technocratic planning, which was embodied by the work of Hartland Bartholomew. He was a city planner in St. Louis who, through his consultancy, developed master plans for an overwhelming number of American cities. A contemporary of Robert Moses, his idea of using data for slum clearance and urban renewal had dramatic effects on the city as we see them today. It should be noted that Bartholomew and Moses didn't get along, which is interesting. Actually, Bartholomew felt Moses was not comprehensive enough. Interesting. But Bartholomew really took this idea of mapping. He thought it was essential to the work of planners.
But he was deeply criticized for his technical approach because while his maps did expose issues of urban poverty and blight, they did not attempt to alleviate the situation of populations that lived there, but rather moved them to the periphery. Their voice was not heard through the data. Federal homeowner assistance maps, this one of Philadelphia in 1937, are an example of how maps can be misused in this way. While the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation might have used these maps to deny mortgage, it is often thought that once these maps were in the hands of the private sector, the practice of denying a mortgage based entirely on neighborhood characteristics became common practice. Using maps in this way became one of the huge fears of planners. Maps are powerful, they work, and how can we ensure that they will not be misappropriated? To essentially redline neighborhoods, I think in many ways this is where the contention between maps and planning begins. At the same time, we can look at Kevin Lynch's work in 1958, The Image of the City, and I think he gives us an example of how we can use maps to observe place and do it through the eyes of the citizen. And so in his work, he actually asked people to trace how they saw their city, and so kind of beginning to change this paradigm between the powerful representing the unpowerful. I bring in Ian McHarg into this debate because I kind of feel like he's kind of the next iteration, and he's important to our discussion of GIS, often considered the father of GIS. McHarg layer-based decision techniques are often considered the basis for ecological design and making. Yet while we as planners and landscape architects borrow his ideas, we also see them as too prescriptive. And I think that's another kind of contention that we have. There's a contention between the design field and this kind of prescriptive use of mapping. And I think Jim Corner, who was actually a student of McHarg, borrows much from his ideas, but he wants to bring the creativity in maps back to the front. As a student of Penn's landscape architecture program, I witnessed the debate/fight as Jim tried to develop his own ideologies for how mapping could be used as a design tool or as a new way of seeing space. So how can we use this kind of prescriptive decision-making of McHarg and then kind of represent it in new ways? And I think we're still debating this. This is a debate in design. So here we are in the age of data enthusiasm, which is evidenced by a quick image search on the topic. Maps and data are becoming increasingly popular ways to tell stories, from popular media to the way novice data operators use this data. And we've heard some of those examples today. I think, visual geographic information. I would say we're at a critical moment, and we're at a moment where we need to think critically about these data visualizations. And I think I would like to call for something called critical data visualization, which is a set of alternative practices which explore how we can make the work we do with data and images richer, smarter, more relevant, and more responsive to the needs and interests of the citizens traditionally on the margins of policy development. Citizens traditionally at the margins have often been those who have suffered the most from the use of data and data visualizations for policy, as they have little access to control of how data was used to tell the story about places they live. This is one of the biggest criticism of the use of maps and mappings in urban renewal. This image is actually from Robert Moses, not from Hartland Bartholomew. The work could continue. I would love to have a debate between the two of them. But I believe the development of the tools have equalized access to data. But at the same time, the ability to visualize data has worked to the benefit of marginalized groups. And I think some of the projects in my research lab show how you can use data to help marginalized projects. And one of the first projects that we have in the lab, and I should also, I forgot to correct you, I co-direct the lab with Laura Kurgan, who's an architect. I think also one thing that I want to say is collaboration is very important to the work that we do in the lab. We work in the realm of policy, analysis. We need to have experts that work with us as well. So in our project Architecture and Justice, we took a data set of incarceration. These are actually when people get recorded as going to prison. It tells us how long they're going to be in prison and where they lived before that. And we figured out how much it costs to incarcerate them. We knew where they lived based on the data record. And we added it up block by block. In that year, and this map was developed, the data came from 2005, and $359 million to imprison people for Brooklyn in just that 1 year. We decided to represent the data, and this is actually adding up the cost to incarcerate prisoners from each block in Brooklyn. And those red, very stark red blocks are places where over $1 million was spent to incarcerate people from that block, but those same blocks have very limited city services. Some of the reasons that the people are in prison, or the idea of the map, is to illustrate this inequity in resource allocation. But those carts are not distributed evenly across the city. Prison expenditures, like prisoners, are concentrated in very few neighborhoods. If we take Community District 16, it has 3.5% of Brooklyn's population, but, whoops, sorry, went too fast, 8.5 of its prison emissions. On a financial scale, prison is becoming the prominent, or was it just going on that? It was definitely not touching me at that time. On a financial scale, prison is becoming the predominant governing institution in the neighborhood, but the money goes elsewhere. So from a demographic view, the spending facilitates a mass migration, 95% who eventually return home. And this map we created, which actually shows where people lived before they went to prison, and the prison, it's attached to the prison that they are going, kind of trying to illustrate the amounts of money that's spent going upstate, essentially. If we zoom in closer, these 11 blocks, over $12 million is spent to incarcerate people from this 11 blocks in 2003. So the idea was to think mostly about this idea of resource allocation. And the maps actually, and this is what we try to do with all of our projects, is try to have an impact on policy. They actually affected the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2009. I'm going to skip through this because I'm realizing I'm close for time, and I've actually a ton more that I want to tell you about, so I'm going to have to speed talk. But one thing, this slide, actually the maps from the $1 Million Blocks were in MoMA, and the only reason I show this slide is because part of the research in the lab is really about thinking about taking analysis and bringing it to audiences that might not otherwise see it, and doing that through creating compelling visuals of that. So we do quantitative analysis. We do, all of our maps that you'll see are done in GIS, which is a surprise to most people. But I believe that it can be possible to make graphically compelling representations in GIS. But I think we're at a moment where I think we need to think, and this goes to all the talks that we had today, we need to think about three things. They're kind of urgent. There's a call for data literacy. Open data means we have more access to it. And we need people skilled in analyzing, collecting, and visualizing it ethically and responsibly. We need to be data literate. Two, if we're going to be kind of amateurs in data accuracy, or data representation, I would call for a new data visualization and collection tools. In order for the public to own the stories that tell about their communities, accessible tools need to be developed to allow them to easily collect and visualize this data. And I also think we need to make a call for private data for public good. If the majority of our data is now being stored by private organizations, we need to create, and I think the quote is like 80% of our data is owned by private organizations. We need to create policies that allow us to analyze this for our public good. So hopefully I can go through quickly some projects that I think are examples of this, and I'll try to go more quickly than I did with the $1 Million Blocks project, and hopefully then you guys can ask me questions about them at the end. So one great example of government data for public good was a project that we did, and I think cities need better tools to systematically analyze their crowdsourced data. Cities are crowdsourcing all kinds of information, and one of the biggest examples of that is the 311 data set. Do you guys all know what 311 is? Emergency phone call. Great, I can skip over that. Oh, you guys don't? So 311 is the emergency.
That's okay.
Yeah, okay. You can ask the question.
You can call 311 to find out.
Exactly. Well, 311 is the non-emergency hotline for New York City.
Professor Kate in the chair, please.
Oh, yes. Wait.
Occupy stomach.
I thought when you had a chair, you were always entitled to it.
Chair doesn't get the
Well, so you could call and complain about that if Harvard had a 311 hotline. But the 311 hotline is really a way to people call to complain about rats. Actually, noise is the #1 thing people call about in New York City. But this is a huge amount of data that the city's collecting, and they realized this. And I started to partner with the Department of Information and Technology in New York, and actually they paired me up with the Department of Sanitation, an unlikely combination, to think about how they could kind of systematize some of their analysis. So we did a project. We created a report for them that this is how the data looked to them, a bunch of points, and we kind of aggregated it. I'm going to kind of skip to the punchline, which is basically we use different kind of clustering techniques to understand anomalies or issues in the data. And one of the biggest things that we found about the New York sanitation data is that certain groups were not complaining, and that was largely immigrant communities were not complaining, as well as the Upper East Side, which is but so in one perspective, you would think South Bronx, which is one of the poorest communities in New York City, is not complaining about trash, but it's more likely that they don't know that they complain. So we use these maps to actually promote services for 311 to talk about that. Another project is that there's much more fine-scale data that we have available to us now, point-based data that can tell us richer stories about place. In a region project that we worked on, which was called Made in Midtown, we used industry data to kind of discuss a zoning kind of issue in Midtown using some IRS data that I was able to get about businesses, sales, and what we did is try to kind of look at how Midtown was important to the overall industry of New York City. So we can see 79% of the apparel industry is in Midtown. But I think one of the biggest kind of iconic maps for this project is we know that apparel industry, and particularly apparel manufacturing, is declining. But we discovered that it's declining to its core in the garment district. And so if we're going to rezone it, it would have a huge effect on the industry. These are some other graphics that we created. We also found that there's a niche market for women's wear apparel, also in Midtown, which would also affect a kind of move or rezoning revamp. Ultimately, not just my work, but the group of everybody who worked on that collaborative project put the zoning issue to reevaluation. So they are now using some of the data and maps to reevaluate what they had slated for zoning in that neighborhood. Okay, so tools. I talked about a call for tools. And so I'm going to talk about one project which we developed tools. We need to create data tools for policy development, and creating tools to mine and allow citizens to collect their own data can change the dynamics of the power for controlling information. And I think one example of where we did that was during the Beijing Olympics. And I always start this talk by showing this image of Beijing in 2004, and I thought, how the heck are they going to have Olympics here? And so we wanted to know how we could expose air quality, how we could develop sensors that would allow us to measure that air quality, and team up with somebody who could tell our story. So we teamed up with the Associated Press on this project. We made 2 different air sensors to look at the regional effects and localized effects of air quality, and we wanted to make these highly mobile so that you could go anywhere with them. And these are actually some of the Associated Press reporters during the Olympics using the devices. They were all over the city. This is actually an image that they did on the marathon route. we did the marathon route before. During the Beijing Olympics, they removed half of the cars off the road during the Olympics. So we did a measurement before and a measurement after. And the CO levels decreased in some areas by half. That's not true for particulate matter. That big red line is how much particulate matter was during the Olympics. You can see this kind of white dashing line right here is the World Health Organization standards for developing countries. And we can see some on even the day of the start of the Olympics, we're way over that marker. These are some of the visualizations that we worked with the Associated Press, which is interesting relationship, trying to work with press on visualization strategies. They have their techniques and standards, so that's something that I could speak to. Ultimately, China actually contacted me after this project because they wanted to know how I got the devices in and so forth. But I think
What did you tell them?
I have no comment. GPS devices which were on these are actually illegal, and the way the Associated Press is allowed to have them though, so they were. One of the great reasons that we partnered with the press for that project. So ultimately, actually, Beijing has realized the reduction of CO on the roads has been an improvement, and they've actually reduced the number of cars. I'm doing a project right now in the garment district again, which looks at kind of how proximity matters to the garment industry. And this is one that we're just doing, so I think I'm going to really just go over, kind of skip over it because we haven't come to all of our findings. But what we're doing is we're using Foursquare, which is a kind of mobile cell phone device to trace or create basically time diaries of people in the apparel industry to understand how proximity matters to their everyday work. So by using this cell phone, we can know their route, and they also tell us what they're doing. So whether they went to a snaps fastener wholesale manufacturer. This is another person who went to a sewing manufacturer. These are all the points. We're still analyzing this data right now, so keep posted. And this is a project that I'm doing with my colleague Elizabeth Curd as well again. So another project, how much time can I go over?
Right now you're at like -3, so.
-3, okay.
I can give you 2 or 3 minutes from my time.
Oh, really? Can I borrow time?
So now you're even, and we'll give you an extra 2 minutes.
Wow, we could start a betting scenario. How much time have you got? Another project, so I think, so I just kind of discussed a lot of tools that can be used, but I also think this big data issue is an issue, and there's kind of, to get back to this idea of private data for a public good, a project that I did with Elizabeth Curd, we actually took all the images in the Getty image database and geolocated them to understand how media represents space in the city, and so we took images like this. We figured out where their locations were, kind of plotted them on a map, and then we ran certain types of analysis on them. And we actually did some cluster analysis to look at how different industries, arts industries, cluster in the city. This map actually shows theater. And one of our biggest findings from this study is that the images cluster around what we've called event enclaves. So the Sunset Boulevard, Hollywood, Beverly Hills, Fifth Avenue in New York, Midtown. And really it's because Getty wants to sell their pictures. The promoters, marketers want to sell their product, and they use what's iconic in the city to do that. So they focus around Times Square, they focus their pictures, or promoters are focusing their images or their parties in places that are iconic or have that iconic nature in the city. And so I think it shows that promoters, marketers actually have much more of an influence on the city than we might have thought by kind of using these iconic elements. So another example of private data for public good, I would say is a recent project that I did over the summer, understanding the psychological, just psychological city, or that's what we found. It wasn't what we intended to find, but what we found and what we did in this project is actually we wrote code and hacked into the databases of Foursquare and Facebook using their API and downloaded all the check-in information over a 2-week period. On the aggregate, they don't say a lot. They say that we check in everywhere. We like to tell people where we are. We began to categorize this data. Maybe the Foursquare check-ins on one side, Facebook check-ins on the other. Foursquare users like to tell us about the mundane things they're doing in life, where Facebook users really like to kind of broadcast, I was at the Empire State Building, or kind of more symbolic events. As one might expect, you kind of see an increase in check-ins over the weekend. These are some of the check-ins, common check-ins: Little Italy, LaGuardia Airport, Times Square, Coney Island. We actually did this during 4th of July week, and there was a Coney Island hot dog eating contest. We kind of started, oh, these aren't coming very good on this computer, but we created topographic maps that showed density check-ins to try to understand the space differently. But I originally did this project to see how...
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. I'm just going to skip through this. We can talk about it. But one of the biggest things is that people told us the psychology of the city. They checked into just about everything. They checked into their personal heavens and hells. They checked into the 7th circle of hell over there, a marriage apocalypse. So people use this to kind of tell us a different kind of space in the city, their personal spaces in the city. I will just leave that with my kind of 3 calls to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can you visualize that?
Okay, here we go. I think pretty much everything has been said, so let's see if I can offer some thoughts on some of the challenges that I'm facing in my research and work. I need this closer?
Yes.
I can also try to...
No, just lift it.
Lift it, and then we can just compute it.
Just tilt it. Tilt it.
Just tilt
Let's
it.
just do it.
There you go.
I tried that. Yeah.
There.
Yeah. Technology. Okay, here we go. So I'm also working in collaboration in University of Michigan. We don't have such a productive lab, but I'm working with a colleague of mine that also shares with me a background in architecture, but also in biology. And this is our way of trying to play with data and also with informed design. The work that I'm going to be sharing with you is pretty much work in progress, so you're going to see different explanations in the maps, and you are also going to be looking at maps that are being processed with many different software. So it's not only GIS. After using GIS, we apply other processes until we get what we want. So there is a lot of discussion, and I'm happy to see if things are working or not. So. Here we go. And this is not in the way in which it's organized, but these are the different themes, different topics that I was thinking of sharing with you in the way in which we talk, we discuss those in our work. And my work is pretty much focusing on research and also in teaching. And the good thing about Michigan is that we can share both agendas. working on the same projects, which is a unique opportunity for junior faculty. So you will see how sometimes the projects are not solicited. It's work that we are proposing to the students, are working with them, and sometimes the projects are coming from grants that are more or less specific, and I will be pointing out those things. So here we go. The very first thing that I want to talk about is this idea. Of course, everything has been covered already. Understanding mapping as a tool for visualization, for dealing with data, with information, with the creation of knowledge, and the integration of all these things. So I would like to start with a quote by Harlan Woodward saying that maps are graphic representations that facilitate a spatial understanding of things, concepts, conditions, process, and events. And the way in which I would like to talk about cartographies is as a tool for visualization, a really powerful tool that allows us to elaborate, manipulate, transfer, and disseminate data, information, and knowledge. So pretty much the way in which I use cartography is as a way of inquiry. We visualize phenomena, we understand patterns of change, locate opportunities, speculate on the highest impact of our interventions, and not that we are there, but we very much expect to be able to test the performance of some of those proposals. The way in which I understand this discussion in between data, informed design, and the creation of knowledge is pretty much in the elaboration, in the process, in the transition in between the raw data that we are receiving and how we are able to create knowledge. And that's only happening because we are trying to follow a specific methodology in which we are careful with what are the things that we are observing. We try to establish clearly what are we measuring. We try to be precise. We try to repeat things. We try to test things in different scales. And we question transferability. And finally, we spend a lot of time trying to communicate these things to different disciplines because the questions are different and we are very much interested in incorporating very different audiences in our work. So all this has to do with how we frame questions and hypotheses that are later going to be tested and proving in its accuracy. So in order to share with you some of the work that came from one of the initial grants that we got, let's see if this is working or not. Probably not. Okay, here we go. So the first proposal that we worked was pretty much trying to learn about the region. This is almost nothing, the Great Lakes region. So most of the work that I'm going to be sharing with you is located in this area. And we didn't have very specific questions. We were interested in using mapping as a way of representation, as a platform to communicate and educate the public in issues that had to do with water quality. And we work different outputs. We work on what we thought it was an interesting platform for sharing information. We call it an atlas. And part of this was a series of representation. This I'm not doing very well. Okay. And part of what we did was pretty much trying to communicate with the public what were the issues dealing with water, and we were contesting a little bit political boundaries and watershed boundaries. So, of course, we need to deal with policy, and we took that as a great opportunity, not only to explain how water works, but how water is being managed, but also to use that policy to zoom in and change scales, because as you can imagine, we cannot keep working at the scale of the entire region and be precise and specific. So these maps that you are seeing are pretty much trying to go through all the different layers that are relevant when we are dealing with the stormwater. And as you see, little by little, we are framing what is the role of urban areas. That is where, as architects and planners and landscape architects, we have some agency, and that's really important for us. So as a way of moving from the entire scale of the region to specific areas, we choose policy, and this is the way in which the International Commission is going from, this is all the region, and these are the areas that are dealing with more polluted waters. And pollution implies that you cannot use the water in very specific ways. And as you can see, all this is trying to convey policy, relatively complicated issues in a playful way, because we are trying to be able to engage in a conversation people that are not that willing to read very long reports dealing with planning policy. Little by little, we are focusing, and Detroit is a great opportunity to work because it's one of the areas of concern that is more severely polluted. And this is the moment in which we were able to test different ways of dealing with output. And what you're seeing here is an unfolded map that was allowing us to represent some of the issues, the same themes that we were representing in traditional cartographies, but this time in a different way. And this was allowing us to be a little bit more specific, locating areas where our interventions could have a bigger impact. So as you see, the bigger peak is exactly Detroit. That's the area that we are working on, and we are working on that area thanks to a different grant. This second grant, I did it again. Came through an interesting collaboration. We are working for the university, but also for a group that is called Data Driven Detroit. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about this, what I mean by the publics, who are the different publics involved in maps, consuming maps, generating maps, commissioning maps, and who are these interested publics. What is interesting here is that Data Driven Detroit wants to have information accessible for everybody. The city of Detroit, as you know, is dealing with many, many different struggles, and one of them is the lack of capacity to deal with a strong planning department. So what is happening is that there are different initiatives that are pretty much decentralized, are happening without any kind of municipal concern. So what this organization is trying to do is trying to create an open source so that everybody can have access to that. And they are interested in doing that through the creation of an index of sustainability. And what we are doing as part of that index of sustainability is working on urban runoff. Literally, that's what it is. We are providing a series of maps, a collection of information that will allow everybody to know what are the issues overall in the city and in specific areas. So I'm going to go relatively quickly. These are the ways in which we are looking. This is the ways in which we are looking at the environment. Of course, we need to understand impermeability. That's the way in which we can act. We cannot deal that much with infrastructure. We can deal with impermeability, changing the condition of the surface of the ground. We can deal with zoning with specific regulations. Buildings need to start holding some responsibility on stormwater. We need to understand water infrastructure, period. We cannot rely on our capacity to act on that in any other way. And finally, we are interested in design synthesis and engaging the cultural layers. Very quickly, because otherwise it seems a class, the problems of stormwater runoff in Detroit are difficult to convey because everybody thinks that vacancy implies more capacity to absorb water. But if you see in here, the problem is that Detroit is a tiny little bit of the area that is being served by the system. It means that when the huge pipes, when the huge trunk lines arrive to the city, it's already too late. They are already too overwhelmed. And the thing that is really, really overwhelmed is the wastewater treatment plant. So these are different ways of looking at Detroit, and this is pretty much the work that we are developing right now. That's why things are not yet finished. But what you see here are corridors, industrial corridors in the city. And what I hope you're going to see here is the study of flow. This is it. When it rains, these are the areas where stormwater tends to concentrate. And that implies a series of opportunities. We have redrawn, regenerated, and this is all done through GIS. Different watersheds created with this superficial flow. And this is a way of looking at vacancy in a different way, looking at vacancy as opportunities to start qualifying which are the areas that the city should hold property on and not not repurpose those areas for redevelopment. And all this that you see right now, it's in black, it's our vacancies in the city. So this is another way of looking at the geography of the city, very quickly. This is the way in which the city is divided in terms of seaward districts. And what we have done is a pretty thorough inventory of all the different districts in the city. This is a little bit more about central city, the area that is holding bigger densities, is where downtown is located. And what you see in here, sorry, I went too quickly, are some studies of how, and it's jumping from one to the other, sorry. Anyway, so we have different studies of outfalls, failures in the system, and you cannot see it. Anyway, this is one of the initial areas where we have found more opportunities, more possibilities for design interventions is the Quindercut, and hopefully in a few months we will be able to have initial proposals for this area. And again, some of the thorough studies that we are doing dealing with stormwater runoff. The second issue that I would like to talk is this understanding of technology, workflows that you have seen. Pretty much all the maps have sophisticated treatment as much as we can do. And we are also interested in sharing this with, and I don't know if you can see this, in sharing this with our students. So part of what we are doing, both in our research and in class, is transitioning in between ArcGIS, rhinoceros, and the fabrication lab that we have. That implies that we can have different material outputs that are not only drawings, are also physical models where we can start playing with water and testing water and getting excited about how different treatments of the surface end up proposing or end up in different opportunities for design. So apart from this idea of technology literacy, of course, we are really interested in talking about sources. One of the biggest problems that we have is access of data. If you see, pretty much all the maps that I've been sharing with you so far are pretty much American-centric. That means that we don't have that much access to Canada. And of course, if we are trying to understand how these two different countries are managing the water quality, we need to have the same amount of information and pretty much the same updated for both. So this is something that I wanted to bring here to share with you, because I'm sure I'm not the only one sharing these concerns. But that's one of the areas in which we need to invest more money and more time trying to update data. And also because we are producing new data, we are producing new information, and there is not a clear or a structured way of sharing that and ensuring that everybody knows what is the raw data and the data that we have been manipulating. So again, it's almost like claiming for a new model of GIS library that can serve everybody and where everybody can contribute, which right now seems to be a little bit out of our reach. Very quickly, some images that are trying to deal with some of the issues that some of my colleagues have been talking before. These are some of the problems that we bring to the students. This that you see is not the screensaver of Windows, it's a lampshade. This lampshade, if you see with a little bit of attention, has a fence right on the top, because this is what is happening on the other side of the hotel. It's operating. So we have a golf course and we have a landfill at the same time, which is a pretty smart way of using this facility. And what we were trying to do with the students is pretty much deal with the spatial justice. Not environmental, not social. We were interested in dealing with the spatial justice and trying to question what's happening with our waste in a time in which we only talk about recycling. Michigan continues to be one of the great buyers. We have a super cheap real estate for waste, and that's something that our surrounding estates benefit. And what you see here is, again, GIS being used to try to communicate some of these issues. And here we are folding and unfolding maps, and we are using these cartograms as a way of quickly convey what is going on. Tipping fees are the main reason why. This is the real estate, it's cheap, that's when waste go. And also trying to convey what is going on. These are the 10 landfills that are surrounding the city of Detroit, and when we look historically, what we see is that residential land use has changed from roughly 7 to 15% to in between 20 and I think 49%. So what is happening is that at the regional level, there is not that much concern about how we are managing our land. And again, we think it's a resource that we have in abundance, but that's not always going to be the case. And this is trying to understand Detroit, again, the most populated area in the region, and it's also the area that is completely surrounded by these landfills. Again, some use of historical maps to try to understand this is our way of dealing with time and bringing those things to part of the discussion that we are having with the students so that we can later on project things more thoroughly. And finally, this interest in talking and sharing with you who are our publics and who are the doers, the generators of maps, and in a way today I'm here in that capacity today. I pretty much work generating, my work is about generating maps, but I'm interested in talking about audiences. Who are we producing these maps for? Are we educating? Are we just creating interest? Who are our clients? Who are the ones that are commissioning this work? As part of what we do on our research, this is the way in which we are framing some questions and framing some of the problems that we promised in our grant proposals that we will be solving, but who are other clients? Who is commissioning this kind of work? And finally, who is criticizing? And we have had plenty of that today, so I don't need to go over it again. Finally, as a way of talking a little bit on this idea of GIS, cartography, this idea of how are we trying to use this to bring together different disciplines? I don't think this work can be labeled as planning or landscape. We are a little bit too far from the architectural scale, but we are pretty much trying to engage all the different disciplines in this conversation. And GIS is so far an interesting platform for engaging all these different publics. And synthesis, what I'm going to be showing right now are different ways in which we are starting to make more precise questions and trying to move from this initial analysis to more design propositions. Very, very quickly, different ways of looking at the landscape, regional landscapes, understanding that landscape itself can be a driver, and after doing maps that are being selective a little bit on what is map, what is getting in the map and what is getting out of the map, this is the question that we are doing, this is the provocation. What if we assign a positive role to the voids that are part of reservoirs in urbanized areas? And what if we suggest that when there is no water available, those voids are not that positive? So what you're seeing here is a very playful approach, dealing with literally the different elements that we found in that portion of the territory. Urbanized areas, the water system, and then when we bring together all these issues, we come up with a potential opportunity for green corridors along these areas. Felipe is telling me that I need to finish. Again, another project in which we start.
So I will continue.
I'm having 1 minute. Okay, starting with the rigorous mapping of the different systems.
Rahul is about to
No,
sell again.
yeah, I'm selling again. Yes.
Okay, so I'm finished.
He's already in -2.
Okay, so this is a way of bringing on the same territory a series of players, of activities, starting to propose a project in this territory, but always using cartography actively, other ways of getting, and this is my attempt to get the closest we have been so far to the architectural scale, bringing some of the same concerns that we are dealing with at the scale of the territory. That's it.
Okay, so let's move to the front of the table.
Thanks.
First of all, thank you for two fantastic and very provocative presentations. And I would just want to briefly ask a quick question and then open it to the audience. And I think something that sort of both of you addressed in the initial presentation is that the two of you work within the space of course, of the academy. And teach as well as sort of research and develop this work. And for me, if we're talking about audiences, perhaps an audience that I think would be interesting to address in this regard is the students. And how could you sort of reframe your presentation or your work in terms of how that informs the structuring of a curriculum in which you actually instruct students in relation to this?
Right. I think. I'll just pass it on. This is something I thought about a lot. When I came to Columbia a while back, there was no designers in our department. GIS was the only way to kind of think about some of these design issues, but also about analysis. And I think it's important for students to kind of frame, I kind of think of it as practical research, and so that I frame teaching GIS and spatial analysis through practice. And when I say practice, we actually work, all of our exercises work with a community group. And I actually sat down with them when I developed the curriculum and I said, what are the things that you need to use GIS for? And so all the exercises outline that. But that practice is important. But then understanding how to frame a research question is really, really important. So what I try to do is in the second half of the class, really guide them through kind of being critical about their research. I think the only way you can learn GIS is through doing. And so to make your own project that's relevant, that has an interesting research perspective is really important.
Maria?
So I teach in architecture and in planning, and what I teach in planning is a real boot camp, in which in one semester we cover pretty much all the softwares that you've seen involved in the presentation, which GIS, we do a little bit of a SketchUp because planning students really need that to engage communities. We do all the Adobe Creative Suite Pack. We do a little bit of Rhinoceros, a little bit of AutoCAD because I require them to build models. I think it's something really, really useful. And pretty much by the end of the semester they need to have a portfolio, and they totally hate me. So this is the way in which I make sure that they are ready to move forward through other courses that have to do with professional practice, the workshop, and finally another course that I'm also teaching, which is joint studying between architects and planners. And the situation right now in planning is that there are not that many opportunities for students to engage in making. So they need to be really, really challenged and active and engaged in these 3 semesters in total in which they can really take this opportunity. The other course, and you have seen some images of that, is liquid planning. And what we are doing in liquid planning is bringing architects, planning students, and students from the School of Natural Resources and working with them in the same way in which we do research. So similar way of questioning things, similar way of looking at the territory, and similar ways of using different softwares to actually construct and test some of those models. So this is what we can do, sharing what we do in our research with the students, because we very much think that they are the educators in the future. So there is a real responsibility, not only educating them as professionals, but as future educators too.
Thank you.
Well, I want to add just one thing, is as also just a GIS practice. I think I don't teach them our GIS per se.
Right.
I teach them how to do spatial thinking, and I think I want to just add, I teach them all kinds of different GIS programs. They learn ArcGIS, they learn GRASS, they learn DREASY, which I used to work for, of course, but I think it's important to kind of teach teach people that it's not, you're not learning GIS, you're learning to be geographers, spatial thinkers, as I would have.
Very good, thank you. I think with that we can maybe open it, questions to the audience. Joyce?
You both touched on the notion of the public right to private data. And I wonder if you can expand on that. Is that like an eminent domain program for corporate data, or is that a call for hackers to access private data? Or, you know, what is most important in terms of the private data, do you think, for the public to access?
I mean, I think the biggest example of private data for public good, I would actually just would say some of the cell phone research that kind of John Reed's lab, Sensible Cities Lab's been doing. That data has a lot of potential to provide a lot of public good in terms of thinking about flows in cities, navigating traffic, emergencies, events. But cell phone companies don't give that out, but yet they're required to keep it for homeland security purposes. There's like a weird kind of relationship with that data. The government can use that data if they want to surveil you, but they can't use it for kinds of things like transportation planning, analysis. I mean, it's amazing that you've been able to get the data that you have been able to get. But I think there's a lot more potential there, and we don't have any policies around this, none. And I think that's what I'm talking about. Private data for public good. We need to create policies that allow us to interface with organizations that are collecting 80% of the data that we now own. Can we create policies around how we can access and use cell phone data for our public good? Not to be invasive, but that's kind of what I'm meaning. So hacking into Foursquare Facebook, that's my own mission for getting private data for public good. And I think that there's more tools that are open in that way that we can access information.
In our case, it's environmental data. That would be fantastic to have that available, and EPA is not that thorough publishing the data. All the states are reporting very different things, and it's just not enough control, and we spend a lot of time parsing the data and trying to be meaningful with what we do and what we leave behind. So yeah, that would be on our wish list.
Other questions?
This is a question for Sarah. I was very struck by your comment about data enthusiasm, because it strikes me as being very true. And you said, well, we need to be critical of data. But then in the things you presented, they struck me as being what a lot of us who use do GIS projects do. Was there one project which embodies sort of the critical aspect, the critical attitude towards data particularly well from your perspective?
Right. When I say we need to be critical about data analysis, I think that data is being misappropriated. We're in an age of data enthusiasm, and everybody has access to information like the open source data, and there's lots of volunteer geographers. There's lots of data out there, and lots of people are attempting to make visualizations of those. And I don't think that we I think Dennis Wood actually says this, is he says, once something gets put on a map, we believe it as truth. And I don't think that we are taught that maps aren't truth, and that some of the data visualizations that we see have unethical outcomes because the data has been used in ways that they didn't know were problematic. Do you know what I mean?
So does critical for you mean the ends it serves?
When I'm talking about critical data visualization, I'm talking that we need to be critical of the visualizations that we see. If that makes sense, right? Like that we need to be better readers of data.
I just want to extend
yeah.
Because this is something, for those of you who don't know, there's a really small but potent branch of GI science research that deals specifically with ethics. Jeremy Crampton, David DiBiase at Penn State, some of these people. And going back to something that Jonathan was talking about earlier today about closed and open data, and you mentioned hacking twice in your talk. could either of you or anybody, Jonathan, I'd be interested, or Matthew even, what are the ethical dimensions associated with hacking to get these data sets? Are these techniques you would teach students to do? And why not? In true critical GIS or data visualization, is hacking an important subject to broach in a classroom?
Right.
I think Neil wants to follow up with a question to this, so maybe Neil can ask and then you can address.
I just wanted to speak to this question about critical and the critical aspect. I mean, I think it's a really, really important question, and we need to try to get clear, I mean, generally, not just on this panel, about what that means. And, you know, of course, it can mean that one generates knowledge that can be channeled into alternative policy agendas, and that's hugely, hugely important. But I personally would embrace a kind of broader notion of the critical. So with Sarah, I was thinking about your maps on the $1 million blocks, and it just resonated for me, particularly because of, I mean, the broader question of like the prison industrial complex and the way that affects our cities and our society. So I had the opportunity a couple times to teach for the Bard Prison Initiative, which is a college and prison program in upstate New York. So I taught a class on critical urban theory in a maximum security prison a couple different times through the BPI. And one of the things that was really amazing about that was that I taught the same material to NYU undergrads, kind of on, you know, critical perspectives on urban inequality. And it resonated in some ways, and in some ways it didn't. But in the prison with the guys, they're all men, and mainly men of color, who I taught, it was actually an incredible experience, because in some cases, the things that they learned from reading people like Engels or reading people like Loic Falcon on the prison industrial complex, it resonated with what they already knew through their life experience. But in other cases, I found that it led them to have a transformed perspective on their own situation. And it wasn't really that knowledge would enable them to necessarily do anything different. I mean, they were incarcerated. But to me, I mean, it's a longer conversation, but it resonated with what I think a key aspect of like critique is all about. It's about social consciousness. And I think that, you know, not just this panel, but many of the presentations today, they really resonate with that role of mapping, the ways in which mapping, not just through its institutional uses, but more generally can transform our social consciousness of how the world works. So that's more of a comment than a question. I think.
Oh, should I respond? Hacking, should we teach hacking? Absolutely. Why not? I think, I mean, it depends on the situation, right?
Well,
There's no...
yeah. I guess my point was, you're saying we need to be critical, this is real quick, critical
right.
of the maps that we see.
Right.
What about the maps that we don't see in the society? I think that's something we need to be critical of too.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think part of the experiment of downloading the Facebook and Foursquare data was to understand what these organizations see about us, what we're telling them, and we're telling them a lot. We're telling them very personal things, as you could see in the Foursquare data. We're telling them where we do those things, but we should own that data. We don't own that data. So part of the project was also taking the data back. I mean, you can reacquire it, and I think that's an issue for a lot of with the cell phone data too. Is like, who owns this data? I mean, it's my personal information. Do I own it? Does the cell phone company own it? Does the government own it? These are critical questions that we need to think about. Cell phone data could be used for good or evil. Be used for civic. So I mean, that's kind of part of the talk. Is, you know, maps can work on both sides, and so we need to be critical about that interpretation. Is part of what I mean.
I mean, if I could add in a way to that, and sort of to Neil's comment, which is that in a way, yes, a large percentage of the work is visualizing sort of these processes. But for me, sort of the question that I would have to you specifically is, then what process of transformation should they instill, right? Either sort of through a particular design process, through sort of social awareness. What sort of, for me, the critical moment is the moment that you translate that into some form of action.
Right.
And I wonder what that could be in your eyes.
Right, like the form of action of those visualizations, like when does that happen?
And how does it happen? Yeah.
When and how does it happen? I mean, gosh, each project, and this is an interesting, a very good question, because people ask me all the time about the $1 Million Plots. How did it affect? Or they ask me about the 311. How do you know that it affected us positively? And I think with data and visualization, sometimes there's an immediate effect. Okay, it helped the a certain policy, but visuals resonate. They're there. We absorb them. We kind of think about them. We see them again and again. The kind of effect isn't always that I made a. It's not. It doesn't happen right away sometimes. I mean, I think the transformation of the data and exposing an idea might happen right away. My kind of idea of seeing the maps as $1 Million blocks, that was an idea that I wanted to present to a new audience. But I think, how does it affect? I think the maps, $1 Million blocks, they were done, we finished them in 2006. They still resonate in different groups in different areas today.
Any other questions, maybe from this report?
I think, again, the frame of spatializing data is the key frame here. And by the way, it's not always spatialized finally in a map. It can be in a table, it can be in other things. That's, to me, the great expansion intellectually here. Very interesting, very powerful. It empowers people to make all sorts of decisions. And your criticality can, of course, depend on your own point of view. I do think we have to be critical about how we think about the methods, what they imply. They're not ultimately neutral at all, of course. So I would divide out, again, I would start with the biggest frame of spatializing data. Maps are one thing in it. They're representational. Yes, we've got conventionalized maps that have imbued all of us culturally with certain attitudes of things that we need to be shocked about and reminded of, that maybe Australia should be on top and the United States on the bottom. Fine, okay, and I'm going to think about that now. And maybe I'll fly north to Australia next time or whatever. But we realize north, south, east, west, these are all, they have their own implications. So that to me is the empowerment that all of this ultimately does. And it's not just a map in any event, it's spatializing data. And that's a question.
Right, do you want to reply to it?
So is it not just about spatializing data? Is that?
No, I think is that you would.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think.
Do you present a lot without maps?
Well, I have to say no, that's not the case. Maybe because I think inherently maps are my tool to understand the world we live in. We all have different tools that we use. And maps are the way that I like to present kind of different ideas. I definitely present charts and graphs too. Maybe do it without a map, but I like to place us where we exist. So it's kind of a...
But for all of the people, do you decouple spatializing data from maps? Is that an important distinction or a very minor distinction in your view?
I think it's an important distinction, especially because we are today living in a kind of global location age. And this is much more about location than about representation.
That's
Mark, I think
Can I just just a small point. I missed the introductions, Peter and Charles, just in terms of the sort of the history of GIS here at Harvard. And this is more like a kind of general thought. I mean, in some sense, the question of if you're in schools of architecture, mapping was very prevalent in the 90s. And mapping also means a particular thing, I mean, it itself creates its own abstraction as a visual device. In some sense, at a certain moment in schools of architecture, it stands for a project. But it actually is not a project, but it stands for a project. There are versions of mapping that can be a project, but actually the history of mapping in the 90s is a history of a kind of abstraction that develops its own aesthetic qualities that requires deciphering. So you already need to analyze and decipher the processes of mapping that create those particular aesthetic practices. So in terms of the discussion of maps, which are very different than mapping in some ways, it's also very, I think it's very important to ask a question about scale. One of the things that I think is very exciting in a way about the term geodesign or geospatial design is that in some ways it's about geography, and one can claim or reclaim geography in the name of, because we talk a lot about geodesign, but itself it becomes a kind of acronym, which in some ways one almost needs to remind oneself that this is about the geographical, and therefore there is something about the scale of the operations that it is geography. I think at the same time, it's also interesting maybe to see it as geology in a way, because it's also somehow there is, in terms of landscape, I'm just going back to the idea of how this also grows out of landscape architecture. Not that this is necessarily a geological project, but I'm saying the reference to landscape in some ways is also interesting to look at things in terms of the question of multiscalarity or the multiscalar questions, because even in the light of the discussions that we've had about planning or discussions around urbanization, that connection between the local and the geographical, the larger scale, is actually something which is really interesting. And when you look at the art of the map makers, where they are really describing a particular condition in an incredible level of detail, and that GIS is also doing something in a way similar at the scale of the geographical, I think just in terms of the way in which we have knowledge that then helps us to design in a different way, because we haven't talked so much about the procedures and processes of thought making or making of projects. A lot of the discussion are around the articulation of information in visual terms, and therefore it's not a form, it can lead to forms of innovation or creativity or imagining, but it's not really necessarily de facto sets itself up to do that. And I just think that there may be a kind of conversation that we could have in terms of this question of scales of GIS and its relationship to new ways or alternative ways of actually making projects. Precisely because of the fact that we shouldn't forget this history of mapping from the 90s in the schools, and to some degree we're still the inheritors of that. So when we mention mapping, I think we have to also demand something else. And maybe that's your question about what's critical. You know, because the idea of the critical also in some sense has to be discussed in terms of the evaluation of its outcome to some degree. You know? And I think for us, this is for me, this is very exciting in the school, because I also have to ask the question, if we're going to get involved with GIS, how can we be true in some ways to the traditions of the formation of those practices within the school, so that we're actually dealing not just with the continuity of those practices, but with the idea of alternative forms of innovation or the discovery of other forms of practice that can actually help us, you know, in terms of what we do in the context of a school of design, for example. I think that would be, I think for us as we move forward, this is somehow an interesting issue. How do we discuss that? I don't know really, but I think it's important to be able to link it to some of our practices as we go forward with all your suggestions and all the things that you're doing. So.
I don't know if there's time for one.
Please. Yeah, one last comment, and then we'll move to.
These are, I agree, these are very important questions, and I wanted to address, since you missed my introductory remarks. I think that whether GIS presents a new way of knowing or an innovative way of understanding the world is really an important thing. And I want to underline the fact that while we think of these things as being an image-making tool, I think that it's really useful for us in this environment to think of it as being a curatorial device for assembling the observations and understandings of lots of different people, and the ability to retrieve those and to store them and to put them together in different ways to create a more collaborative way of understanding. And so I would just offer that as one argument for the fact that this is a new way of understanding the world that we should pursue.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Raul, every presenter has donated 10 seconds back, so you have your...
I see 2 minutes.
They're supposed to finish by 6:15 now.
Oh, really? You moved it? Okay. No, but I'm not going to take so much time. One reason I've been sort of asking the question of literacy is because I'm challenged by that question myself, and I really must admit, for me, when I started my discussions with Charles, who really initiated this conversation just for our departments, I was really illiterate, and I think just today has contributed incredibly to my education of questions around here. And so I want to start by thanking Charles for having sort of driven this whole process and made this happen, because I think it's going to really have some productive implications on how we're going to think through our own curriculum here at the GSD. I also, Paul, when you were talking about Bill Mitchell and Carl Steinitz and the history, I remember being here as a student that first semester that Bill Mitchell brought the computers on to the desk. I'm dating myself, but what's amazing and unbelievable is real. Yes, what's amazing is how in this time not only is technology changed so much, but how dynamic this sort of collision between these different data sets have begun to create new questions and new challenges, and it's really amazing how that's all grown. And I think we're really at a crossroads where a conversation like this is critical, to use critical, because I think the questions you're raising about cartography, and I think how you've very eloquently placed mapping and its history to the 90s, I think we're at a moment where I think we have to think about this carefully as we move forward. And one of the things I was really struck by, I think Michael, you started that conversation of how the iterative process is embedded through these technologies, and the question of these feedback loops and evaluations that in real time can actually inform these processes, I think adds an edge to this, to the use of this technology and the way we imagine the world around us, the way we imagine data. And I think with new interfaces with other forms of media and technologies, how we can visualize even, I mean, I struck Maria by you even using some form of animation, and how, film and many other intersections can help us create that literacy, perhaps, which will make us see other patterns and other kind of invisible layers and maps that don't exist, because other forms of media might allow us to make that possible. And so, I mean, I think there's a whole space out there. But I mean, what I really learned was that besides organizing knowledge, this also becomes a critical tool to construct knowledge simultaneously, and the question of reflection is again intrinsic to this sort of process, and the question of the role of the university and the role that we can play both in taking this technology to a moment where advocacy, participation, collaboration begin to sort of collapse in interesting way. And a number of you sort of raised this question, I thought, which was really very, very important. What also struck me is that a lot of what we are seeing happening is happening in the lab format, and I think that's how universities have tended to organize themselves in this engagement. And I think one of the challenges, I think, for pedagogy is how we can embed this much more into the curriculum. I think the last decade or two, as these technologies developed, perhaps a lab format was the correct one, which is not to say that the labs were completely insulated, because you clarified how it has a bearing on curriculum when Felipe asked you that. But I think the challenge, and some of the questions that Neil raised in a university like this, or the Graduate School of Design, where we have all the disciplines beginning to kind of blur their own disciplinary boundaries. I think technology itself can be challenged by those questions of social science, questions of planning, justice, ethics, questions of infrastructure, region, scalar questions. and how systemic thinking can actually sort of integrate much better with these technologies, or be facilitated by the use of these technologies in terms of their application. And I think this is going to be a real question which sort of course leads to representation and semantics and representation, and that sort of question that was so sort of eloquently also articulated. I think critical GIS is, it was very useful, and I think it's come up, and this sort of broadening of creating this more inclusive, expansive armature structure for thinking is, I think, related to the way that it can be embedded in the pedagogy and can actually leverage advantageously its sort of position in the university across departments and across disciplines. The question of time, I think Peter really holds the answer to it, although he posed it as a question. But it really is. Right. Oh, yeah, yes, no, but I think that really is an important question, because I think one of the powers, and when you raised that question, it struck me at two levels. One was time in the kind of temporal sense of flux. And a lot of my work, which has to do with the global south, and I'm so happy you showed the Onayan maps, because it made me think of some of those questions in the global south, where this sort of elasticity in the city and the flux, I mean, I think how does one capture it productively is one interpretation of the time dimension, but the other one is this broader imagination of time in both planning and our engagement with sort of regional and scalar questions. And many other cultures have found ways of dealing with that, representing it. And I think that would be a whole area of study which could enrich, I think, our understanding of time, and I think the technology is yet at a point where at moments it feels static, it feels like it's captured a moment and then it lives off that moment, but I think it can engage with real time and in much more interesting ways going into the future. And I think this is the potential which is very promising, and I really would like to thank you all for contributing to this process. Like Charles sort of outlined, it's part of our own process of reflecting upon these questions before we move forward, because you know, I think it's just critical in the way that these disciplines begin to work together, but also evolve in their own sort of disciplinary knowledge. And so thank you very much for doing this for us. It's a real contribution. And with that, I invite you to a reception in the porticos so we can have some fun. Thanks very much. Some more fun.